What happens when the monsters of history grow old? When the hands that once pulled triggers now tremble with age? When eyes that witnessed unspeakable horrors now struggle to read the morning newspaper? This isn't fiction. This is the uncomfortable reality of former SS soldiers living among us today, their pasts buried like landmines beneath decades of ordinary life. The truth is, thousands of former SS members survived the war, and a handful are still alive today, scattered across continents, living under their real names or false ones, some consumed by guilt that eats at them like cancer, others harboring no remorse whatsoever. Their stories force us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. Can evil age into harmlessness? Does time erase culpability? And what do we owe the past when it refuses to stay buried? Let me take you into their world. A world most documentaries won't touch. A reality that exists in the shadows between history and the present day. When World War II ended in May 1945, approximately 800,000 SS members had survived the conflict. Let that number sink in for a moment. 800,000. These weren't just soldiers. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, represented the Nazi Party's elite military and ideological vanguard. They ran the concentration camps where millions died. They executed mass shootings in villages across Eastern Europe. They embodied the machinery of genocide, the administrative engine of the Holocaust. Yet when the guns finally fell silent and the Third Reich crumbled into dust, the vast majority of these men simply melted back into society like ice in warm water. The Nuremberg trials grabbed headlines around the world. 24 major war criminals stood in the dock, facing justice under the harsh glare of international scrutiny. 12 received death sentences. The world watched as Hermann Göring, once Hitler's designated successor, was sentenced to hang. But here's what nobody talks about, the inconvenient truth buried in history books. Nuremberg prosecuted perhaps 200 high-ranking Nazis in total. 200 out of 800,000 SS survivors. The math is staggering, almost incomprehensible. For every one person held accountable, 4,000 walked free. Why? The answer reveals something uncomfortable about human justice and political pragmatism. The Allied powers lacked the resources, the will, and frankly, the stomach for comprehensive prosecution. Germany lay in absolute ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of displaced persons needed to be fed, sheltered, repatriated. Infrastructure required rebuilding. Governments needed reorganizing. Pursuing every SS member seemed not just impossible, but undesirable. The Cold War was beginning its long, frozen standoff, and both sides needed German expertise, even if that expertise came with blood on its hands. So what did these men do? How do you return to normal life after participating in genocide? They became shopkeepers and factory workers, teachers and civil servants, accountants and mechanics. They married sweethearts they'd written to from the front. They raised families in neat suburban homes. They attended church on Sundays, sang hymns, took communion. They transformed themselves into the very picture of post-war respectability. Some changed their names through legal channels or forged documents. Others simply never mentioned their wartime service, and in a society desperate to forget, nobody asked. But can you imagine living with that secret? Think about it for a moment. Sitting at your daughter's wedding, watching her dance in white lace, knowing you once stood guard at Auschwitz, bouncing a grandchild on your knee with the same hands that pulled a trigger during mass executions, sharing Christmas dinner with neighbors, laughing at jokes, while memories of screams echo somewhere in the locked rooms of your mind. How does the human mind rationalize such contradictions? How do you look at yourself in the mirror each morning? Not everyone hid, though. Not everyone lived in shame or fear of discovery. Some former SS members lived openly, unapologetically, even proudly, as if their service was something to commemorate rather than conceal. In the decades after the war, organizations like HIAG, the Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, emerged in Germany. At their peak in the 1970s, they claimed 40,000 members. 40,000 men willing to publicly identify themselves. They held annual reunions in hotels and beer halls. They published newsletters filled with nostalgic reminiscences. They lobbied German politicians for military pensions and benefits, arguing that Waffen-SS soldiers were simply soldiers like any other, caught up in circumstances beyond their control. Think about that audacity for a moment. Men who served in units that committed documented atrocities demanding recognition as legitimate veterans deserving of honors and pensions. And here's the disturbing part. They often succeeded. By the 1950s, West Germany, desperate to rebuild its military in the face of Soviet threats, had integrated tens of thousands of former SS members into its new army, the Bundeswehr. Former SS officers advised NATO commanders. They worked in intelligence services, their expertise valued more than their histories. The architect of the Holocaust's logistics, Adolf Eichmann, might have lived out his days peacefully in Germany if he hadn't made the fateful decision to flee to Argentina. This wasn't just German pragmatism or moral failure. The United States actively recruited former SS intelligence officers for anti-Soviet operations. The infamous Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon for his torture of French resistance members, worked for American intelligence before being helped to escape to South America. Reinhard Gehlen, who ran Hitler's military intelligence operations against the Soviet Union, became the first president of West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service. The Cold War created strange bedfellows, and moral clarity became a luxury superpowers decided they couldn't afford. But what about the ordinary SS members? The ones without valuable intelligence to trade or scientific knowledge to offer. The ones who weren't important enough to be recruited by competing intelligence agencies. They simply aged. They collected pensions from jobs in factories and offices. They became grandfathers who dandled children on their knees and told carefully edited war stories. And mostly, they stayed silent, letting the years pile up like snow covering old graves. How many of them do you think lived in your own family's neighborhood? How many served you in shops or sat next to your grandparents in church? Have you ever wondered what guilt actually looks like after 70 years? Because not every former SS member lived in denial or defiance. Some carried their crimes like physical wounds, festering beneath the surface of seemingly normal lives. Albert Speer was one such case, though his real name has been changed in historical records to protect his descendants. A former SS guard at multiple concentration camps, Speer survived the war and returned to his small hometown in rural Germany. Neighbors remember him as increasingly withdrawn, a man who rarely smiled, who drank heavily in the evenings, who jumped at sudden noises. His wife told local authorities after his death that he suffered terrible nightmares, waking up screaming about things he refused to discuss in daylight. His children grew up in a house heavy with unspoken trauma. In 1971, he hanged himself in his barn, leaving a note that simply said, "I cannot forget what I did. I cannot live with what I am." These stories exist in the shadows of history, rarely documented, seldom discussed. They don't make headlines because they don't fit our neat narratives of good and evil. We want monsters to be irredeemable or justice to be swift and satisfying. The idea of a war criminal suffering quiet torment for decades, then dying alone and unpunished, satisfies neither our need for vengeance nor our desire for redemption. It's messy, uncomfortable, human. Then there are the ones who found religion, who sought some form of spiritual reconciliation with their pasts. Several former SS members became priests or devoted themselves to charitable work in their later years. In the 1980s, a former SS officer worked at a hospital for disabled children in Munich for over 40 years. He was known as a gentle, patient man who volunteered extra hours without pay. When journalists finally tracked him down in the 1990s and confronted him with his wartime record, he didn't deny it. He was asked directly if decades of charitable work absolved him of his past crimes. His answer, recorded in the interview, was haunting. "Absolution isn't mine to claim. I'm simply trying to add something good to a world I helped make monstrous. If there's a God, He'll judge whether it's enough. I certainly can't. Is that enough? Can acts of kindness in old age balance scales soaked in innocent blood? Can you redeem the irredeemable? These questions don't have comfortable answers, and maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not supposed to be comfortable. The 1960s brought a significant shift in Germany's relationship with its past. A new generation of Germans, born after the war into the miracle of reconstruction and prosperity, began asking uncomfortable questions their parents had avoided. What did you do during those years? Where were you when the camps operated? Why are former Nazis still teaching in our schools, sitting in parliament, running businesses and banks? The trials resumed with renewed vigor, but tracking down aging war criminals proved increasingly difficult and ethically complex. Some had fled abroad years earlier, establishing new identities in countries that asked few questions. Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, South America became a notorious haven for former SS members. These weren't just a handful of high-profile cases like Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, or Adolf Eichmann before his capture by Israeli agents. Thousands of lower-ranking SS members established new lives under South American skies. They opened German restaurants and import businesses. They formed tight-knit communities, speaking German at home, celebrating Christmas with traditional customs, sending their children to German-language schools, creating little pockets of the old country, minus the swastikas but not always minus the ideology. In these communities, children and grandchildren grew up hearing sanitized versions of history. The war was a tragedy for everyone. Germany was betrayed by weak leadership. The atrocity reports were exaggerated propaganda by victors writing history. This is how historical revisionism perpetuates itself, not through dramatic propaganda campaigns, but through quiet dinnertime conversations, through grandfathers' carefully edited war stories that omit certain details, through the normalization of lies repeated so often they feel like truth. When Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal and Beat Klarsfeld began tracking these men down, they faced enormous obstacles. Witnesses had died. Records had been destroyed in the war's chaos. Languages and legal systems varied. And critically, host countries often lacked the political will to extradite elderly men who had become integrated, tax-paying members of their communities for decades. What would you do if you discovered your kindly neighbor was once an SS guard? It's easy to demand justice in the abstract, to insist on accountability when reading about historical atrocities. But when the monster has a human face, when he's the old man who helps carry your groceries or whose grandchildren play with your children, when he's been a model citizen for 50 years, the moral clarity gets complicated. Does it make you complicit if you don't report him? Does it make you heartless if you do? Today, in 2024, very few former SS members remain alive. Those who are must be at least 97 years old, teenagers during the war's final desperate years. Yet even now, prosecutions continue in German courts. Germany, to its considerable credit, has never stopped pursuing justice, no matter how delayed, no matter how politically inconvenient. In recent years, German courts have prosecuted men in their 90s and even centenarians. These proceedings are surreal, almost theatrical in their strangeness. Defendants arrive in wheelchairs, oxygen tanks beside them, often suffering from dementia, barely able to follow proceedings through the fog of cognitive decline. They're tried not for specific murders they personally committed but for being part of the machinery of death. German legal precedent now recognizes that if you were a guard at a concentration camp, you're an accessory to every murder that occurred there during your service. The law has evolved to reject the just following orders defense that protected so many in earlier decades. Critics argue this is too little, too late, a performance of justice rather than justice itself. What's the point of imprisoning a 96-year-old who might die of natural causes before completing even a short sentence? Why spend taxpayer money prosecuting someone who can barely remember their own grandchildren's names, let alone events from 8 decades ago? Is this justice or merely revenge? But survivors and their descendants see these trials very differently. They're not primarily about punishment or deterrence. Those ships have long sailed. They're about acknowledgement, about official recognition, about saying clearly for the historical record in a court of law this happened. This person participated. These crimes were real. Justice may be slow, arriving on a walker and speaking through a translator, but it can still arrive. Every conviction, however symbolic, matters to those who lost everything. Others question whether these trials serve justice or merely satisfy our psychological need for closure. Can a person be meaningfully held accountable for actions taken 80 years ago when they're cognitively impaired and fundamentally, neurologically, different from who they were? Their brain chemistry has changed. Their worldview may have evolved. Are they really the same person who committed those crimes? Where do we draw the line between justice and vengeance, between accountability and cruelty? These aren't rhetorical questions designed to provoke. They're genuine dilemmas that courts, philosophers, and societies across Europe grapple with regularly. Perhaps the most disturbing category of former SS members are those who never expressed remorse, who never hid, who simply lived their lives and when asked about their service, defended it without hesitation or shame. Interviews with unrepentant former SS members, conducted by historians and journalists over the decades, reveal a chilling consistency. They describe their actions as following orders, maintaining discipline, doing their duty to the fatherland. They claim they didn't know about the extermination camps, or if they did know, they had no choice, no agency, no power to resist. Some go even further, defending Nazi ideology even in the 21st century, insisting that history will eventually vindicate them, that they were fighting against forces that threatened European civilization. How is this possible? How can someone witness atrocities, participate in genocide, and emerge morally unchanged decades later? Psychologists and historians point to several interconnected factors. Ideological indoctrination so thorough it rewires moral reasoning, the diffusion of responsibility inherent in bureaucratic systems where everyone plays a small part in enormous crimes, and perhaps most disturbingly, the human capacity for compartmentalization. These men could be loving fathers who read bedtime stories and camp guards who supervised murders. They could be kind neighbors who shoveled snow from sidewalks and accomplices to genocide. The mind protects itself by separating these identities into different psychological rooms, never allowing them to meet, never forcing a reconciliation. There's also what psychologists call the pride trap. Admitting guilt after maintaining innocence for 70 years requires a psychological strength that few people possess. It means accepting that your entire adult life has been built on a foundation of lies and atrocity. It means acknowledging that you're not the person you told your children and grandchildren you were. It means destroying the identity you've carefully constructed over decades. Many people simply can't do it. The cognitive dissonance would shatter them, so they double down on denial instead. But what does this tell us about human nature? Are we all capable of such moral blindness under the right circumstances? Given the right pressures, the right indoctrination, the right conditions, could any of us become what we claim to despise? That's perhaps the most frightening question these stories raise. So what have we learned from tracking the lives of former SS soldiers through 8 decades? Perhaps the most unsettling lesson is this: evil doesn't always look like evil. It doesn't announce itself with sinister music and dramatic lighting. It looks like ordinary people making terrible choices, then spending lifetimes either grappling with or evading those choices. It looks like your grandfather, your neighbor, the quiet man who sits in the back pew at church. The former SS members still alive today are the last living links to humanity's darkest chapter. When they die, and they will very soon within the next few years, we lose something, though I'm not sure if lose is precisely the right word. We lose direct access to perpetrators who can answer questions that historians still debate. How did it happen? How did ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil? What were you thinking when you did those things? How did you sleep at night? But we also gain something with their passing: distance. The ability to study this period as history rather than living memory. The question is whether that distance will bring the clarity we need or simply allow dangerous forgetting, whether the lessons will crystallize or dissolve. Here's what I want you to consider as we close. These stories aren't really about the past. They're about how we deal with difficult truths in the present, about the limits of justice in an imperfect world, about the nature of guilt and the possibility of redemption, about our collective willingness to confront uncomfortable realities rather than sweep them under the rug of time. Every society has dark chapters. How we treat our monsters, whether we pursue them relentlessly or allow them to fade into comfortable obscurity, says everything about who we are as human beings. Before we close, I want to ask you something personal. What's the most powerful World War II story you've ever heard? Not from a Hollywood movie or a slick documentary, but a real account that genuinely changed how you understand that era. Maybe it was a story from your grandfather who served, or something you discovered while researching your family history, or an account that challenged everything you thought you knew about the war. Maybe it was a story of resistance or survival, or even one that complicated your understanding of who the good guys really were. Share it in the comments below. These stories matter more than ever. They're how we ensure the lessons of that terrible time aren't lost when the last witnesses, whether victims, soldiers, liberators, or yes, even perpetrators, are gone forever. Because here's the thing we can't forget. Understanding how former SS soldiers lived, how they justified or regretted their actions, how societies dealt with them or failed to, this isn't about satisfying morbid curiosity. It's about recognizing that evil isn't alien or supernatural. It's human, and therefore, so is the responsibility to prevent it from happening again. The last former SS members are leaving this world, their testimonies fading, their secrets dying with them. But the questions they leave behind, those aren't going anywhere. Those questions will haunt us for generations, demanding answers we may never fully have.